Welcome to this lecture of United States history. This time our focus is on the events of the 1850s, events that would propel the United States into a civil war by creating a decade-long crisis over the issue of slavery. We are going to be examining Target 4.01 in your target sheet. Let's begin. When we last talked about the expansion of the United States to the West, we talked about the bringing in of the Mexican War territories and the Mexican Cession, the debate even then in 1846 and 1847 over whether or not that area would allow slavery or not. Southerners said, yes, we need to expand slavery. We need to send more cotton plantations into production. Northerners said no. And the matter got even more heated with the discovery of gold in California. And suddenly people are asking, is California going to be free? Is it going to be a slave state? What's going to happen? In 1850, the United States Congress compromised on the issue. That gives us the Compromise of 1850, a decision on how Americans would resolve their difficulties over slavery in the West. The first thing that we need to talk about in this compromise is the introduction of the idea of popular sovereignty. Kind of sounds like a fancy cologne. What are you wearing? Popular sovereignty. But it's not. It is an idea that is not exactly new, but it has been discussed before this point, and it is the proposal that Americans simply allow the people who live in an area to decide if they want slavery or not. So people who move out west, let's just simply ask them, do you want to have slavery? Do you want to be completely free of slavery? What's your choice? So in doing this, popular sovereignty seemed to skip around the issue. Instead of making a decision, it simply let the decision fall into the hands of the people living in a certain area, which has kind of a nice ring to it. After all, what could be more American than letting people make decisions for themselves, choosing their own fate? A second part of this Compromise of 1850 was the abolition of the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Notice that I say slave trade. I don't say slavery. What is being made illegal is the buying and selling of humans on the streets of Washington, D.C., because that looks really, really, really awful to lots of folks. When you think about the nation's capital being a place where laws are made, where America's experiment in representative democracy is ongoing, to have that next door to an auction of a woman and her child seems to be very wrong. Though Southerners have been completely okay with it since the beginning. So it says slave trade, not slavery. But the most important part of the Compromise of 1850, the one that's in this blue box on your screen, will be the Fugitive Slave Act. And that's the one I want you to pay the most attention to because it's the most controversial and the most problematic. Many of the enslaved of the South ran away. I mean, who wouldn't? Though we do know that most of the runaways are young men. It's probably easier for them to escape unnoticed and to travel to the north, but certainly women do escape as well. And hundreds of thousands of these folks leaving the South proved to be a problem for Southerners, who are losing every time someone runs away about $1,000, roughly, on average. A good working enslaved person would cost about $1,000. So Southerners said in this Compromise of 1850, they wanted a law to make the North return their runaways. And that angered Northerners because it turned Northerners into slave catchers. The law not only compelled Northerners to help catch the runaway slaves, to actually go out of your own home and hunt down people who've run away, it also allowed you to be fined if you said no. So if you refused to help in the neighborhood, the catching of an enslaved runaway, you could actually be fined for doing that. It's one thing to have slavery exist in the South, where it's out of sight, it's out of mind, and you don't really have to think about it. But it's another thing when the law now forces you as a Northerner to protect the institution of slavery. So Northerners erupt in just massive anger over this law because it suddenly pushes slavery into their lives in a way that they didn't have to think about before this law was passed. Secondly, the enslaved who would be caught had no right to a trial by jury. They could not go to a court and say, this is a case of mistaken identity. They couldn't prove that they were somebody else. And that meant that these folks were denied the opportunity to say that they were in actuality free people of the North. In some ways, you could think of this law then as legalizing kidnapping. What would stop a Southerner from going to the North, pointing out some person on the street and saying, yep, that's my person that I used to own? That enslaved person then now could not have any way of proving their innocence or their freedom. And trial by jury is a very important right for lots of Americans. It's valued, it's upheld as something that Americans believe in. Of course, Southerners would tell you it doesn't really apply to the enslaved. In response to this Fugitive Slave Act, many northern states passed what were called personal liberty laws. These laws were an attempt to nullify or to turn the Fugitive Slave Act into nothing. As we learned in an earlier lecture, to nullify means to make zero, to declare that something has no power and no effect. So Northerners were attempting to shut down the Fugitive Slave Act and say they were not going to enforce it. They were not going to act as slave catchers for Southerners. You do find lots of cases of people, African Americans, being captured on the streets of northern cities and taken by Southerners. It even happened here in Columbus. There was a well-known waiter in a local hotel who was essentially lured across the Scioto River to Franklinton, arrested, and then sent to Kentucky. The citizens of Columbus tried to get him back by legal means, but they failed to persuade a court. And then they raised the money to purchase this person and bring him back. But he had developed a lung disease and then died not long after he came back into town. And there are lots of these cases where Northerners are saying, we don't agree with what's going on. This is wrong. The Fugitive Slave Act was bad enough on its own to anger Northerners. But a Northern woman who was living in Cincinnati, Ohio, and knew firsthand people escaping slavery from Kentucky into Ohio, wrote a novel about it. It started out as a series of chapters published in a newspaper and then later made into a book. The book is called Uncle Tom's Cabin. The book became a bestseller, and it was so popular that Abraham Lincoln met the author in 1862 and essentially accused her of starting the Civil War, jokingly, because Lincoln liked to crack jokes. He said, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." In some ways, he's not far off the mark. Harriet Beecher Stowe, the daughter of a well-known preacher influenced by the Second Great Awakening, writes this very, very emotional book, which tells the story of a runaway. Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin sold 300,000 copies in its first year. So people are reading this in the newspaper, then they're buying the book. And as they're doing so, it's increasing their dislike for slavery. They're getting caught up in the story of this girl who's run away with her baby, and they're emotionally connected to her. And they find that what Southerners are doing is just awful. It's horrendous. You're going to learn in your English class, if you haven't already learned, that this is an appeal to pathos, an appeal to emotions. She's really touching people emotionally in this work. And the work has illustrations, full-page illustrations in it. So if you can't imagine it in your head, you can certainly see it on the page. Uncle Tom's Cabin was turned into stage productions with people acting out the story. The stage productions traveled throughout the North. My advisor at Ohio State once found that the number of kids born after Uncle Tom's Cabin came out with the name of the title character, Eliza, or the lead character in the book, Eliza, increased dramatically as people are reading this work and going, I think I'll name my daughter Eliza after the character in this book, the runaway character. The next incident to really anger and inflame tensions between the North and the South is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And we can lay it at the feet of this guy here. His name is Stephen Douglas, a short, heavy drinking man known as the Little Giant. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was based in that idea of popular sovereignty. Stephen Douglas wanted to take popular sovereignty and apply it to two territories out the west, Kansas and Nebraska. These two territories were just getting organized, and people were starting to move to the west. And as they would move, you would get enough people there to have a vote and then potentially at some point have enough to have a state. So Stephen Douglas said, well, why don't we just give them the opportunity to vote on slavery or not? Let them decide. The problem is Kansas and Nebraska are in the north, and Northerners had already assumed that these territories, being in the northern part of the United States, would be closed to slavery. And they assumed that because of the Missouri Compromise. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise drew a line across the United States and said, north of this line, you can't have slaves. South of the line, you can enslave human beings. So when Stephen Douglas proposed this, he's actually violating an earlier compromise that had already settled this issue of where you can have slavery or not. So this proposal is going to really anger Northerners who are going to look at what Stephen Douglas is doing and say, okay, why are you going back on an agreement that we made in 1820 that has worked this far and has already said slavery will be allowed south of 3630. That's the line on the map. Why are you going to go back on this agreement that has served us so well this far? It turns out part of what was all about this was that Stephen Douglas was hoping to get the territory organized because he owned land and wanted to make money off that land when a railroad would be going through it. People got so angry about this proposal that they actually formed a new political party. That party is still in existence today, the Republican Party. Republicans, 1854, are organizing themselves completely in opposition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So that's pretty remarkable that we are getting a new organization of a political group in response to one piece of legislation. The act did pass, and it actually led to a lot of violence in Kansas. That violence became nicknamed Bleeding Kansas. People from the north and people from the south moved to Kansas, hoping to flood into the area, settle it, and then they could vote on slavery or not. Northerners were hoping that there would be enough Northerners settling there to make it free. Southerners were trying to make it slavery, and they met there and decided to shoot each other. Because in a game where having the most votes makes you the winner, then sometimes people think it's okay to kill off the opposition. There were about 200 deaths, $2 million in property damage as a result of the bloodshed and violence in Kansas, of the two sides trying to gain control over Kansas. Kansas was such a mess and so disorganized that it still wasn't a state by the time the Civil War started. And then finally, this act caused an actual fight on the floor of Congress, the Brooks-Sumner affair of 1856. In that incident, a Northerner had made a speech in which he said some pretty direct, in-your-face things about a Southerner, and specifically referring to slavery and that Southerner. So the next day, that Southerner's relative came into Congress, took out his cane, and beat the Northerner just senseless. In fact, the Northerner had to spend several years in recuperation before he could even come back into Congress and function as, a functioning adult. He was beaten that badly. The guy who beat him actually broke the cane in multiple pieces, then walked out, resigned, and went back to South Carolina, where people mailed him replacement canes inscribed with the phrase, "Hit him again." This fight on the floor of Congress is not the first time that this has happened, but it is an indicator of just how much the tensions are rising over the issue of slavery. This is a map of the Kansas-Nebraska territory. You can see that it's more on the northern side. The line that you would draw across the United States would be from here on the bottom of Missouri all the way across. And so there should be no slavery in this part of the United States. But Stephen Douglas said popular sovereignty in this bill that he proposed, and it became law. And then just Kansas just flooded with people who fought each other, and it became a giant mess. Here is a cartoon of the Brooks-Sumner affair at the time. Congressman Preston Brooks is the one with the cane. You can't see his face, and I think that's on purpose. If you can't see a face, you can't sympathize with someone. Charles Sumner, whose face you can see, is getting beat up on the floor. And he's getting beat up because he made that comment about a Southerner and slavery in regard to Kansas, Nebraska, and the fight over slavery there. You see the other folks in the back are just laughing and going, ha 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 ha, look, he's getting his butt whooped. Our next major crisis comes in 1857 in a court case, the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford. The case really started back in 1852 with an enslaved man who had been moved to free territory in the North. And so the case revolved around this question: does someone who's been enslaved living on free territory become free? If I take a person who's in slavery out of a place where slavery is legal to a place where it is not legal, is that person a slave anymore? So that's the crux of this case. It has to decide what happens to property when you move it to a place where that property is not protected. The Supreme Court handed down a complicated decision that actually not only responded to this question, but then made the whole issue of slavery and sectionalism between the North and the South even more tense. The first thing the court said is no. Free soil doesn't make an enslaved man free. Moving you to a place where slavery is banned is not going to set you free, Dred Scott. Any more than a friend of mine used to say, than sitting in a garage makes you a car. So your status as a person is not dependent on where you're located, is what the court's saying here. Now, they could have stopped there. They could have just answered the question and been done with it. But the court went on to make some other statements that really increased tensions between the North and the South. One of those statements was, not only is Dred Scott not a free man, he's not a citizen, and he therefore can't even sue. His right to be in this court does not exist. We're just answering this question as a court because we think we need to provide an answer. And this particular decision here, part of the decision, emphasizes that the founding fathers never intended for the enslaved people to be citizens of the United States. That's a pretty stark statement of what they believe about the founding. But let's go on and see what else they decided. They then decided the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. Congress, according to the Supreme Court, never had the power to prohibit slavery anywhere. So Congress never had the authority to draw a line across the United States, never had the right to say slavery was only allowed south of that line and not north of it. And therefore, the entire Missouri Compromise was not legal. It was not enforceable. I think you can kind of see where this is going here. Not only to decide that Dred Scott is not free, free territory doesn't make you a free man. Not only to decide that he's not a citizen and cannot sue, they've also decided that that free territory that he was on was unconstitutionally created. And then finally, here's the kicker. Slaves are property, and property is protected everywhere. So see if you can follow the thinking here. If Congress can't prohibit slavery anywhere. Slaves aren't citizens. That means you can have slavery anywhere in the United States because your property is your property. You could take your property from South Carolina to Minnesota. And the Supreme Court's saying it's perfectly legal for you to do that because your property is protected everywhere. Northerners reading this case are suddenly thinking, whoa, does this mean the North is now open for slavery and that Southerners can bring the ownership of human beings to the North? What does this court decision imply? This is not good. There is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a Southerner, Roger Brooke Tawney, whose face looks kind of melted here at this point. He's appointed by Andrew Jackson to the court. And this is Dred Scott, who eventually does get freed and then sadly dies not too long afterwards. So he never really gets to enjoy the fruits of his freedom. Our last incident that creates crisis is the man on the right, John Brown. John Brown was a radical, fanatic abolitionist with a deeply religious sense of right and wrong. In his moral universe, in his head, slavery is so wrong that anything he does to attack it is morally justified. So he is on fire against slavery. He gets funding by a northern group that get nicknamed the Secret Six. So they are supporting him in his plans to deal with the issue of slavery. His plan is this. He's going to raid a military depot in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Today, that's in West Virginia. But at that time, it was still Virginia. And he's going to get weapons that he will give to a slave army who will then free the slaves in the South. They will start a war that will end slavery. So this Secret Six is funding him. His plan is, I'm going to raid this area. I'm going to get weapons. We're going to have a slave army, and we are going to attack slavery. It's going to be over. It's a very dramatic plan. It kind of fits in with Brown's religious visions of sort of like an apocalypse against slavery, but it's not a very realistic plan. Harper's Ferry is in the mountains. There aren't many Americans nearby that could be enlisted to fight. It is not a good place to raid in terms of like getting weapons and then spreading them out. So the whole thing fails horribly. Brown and his sons are captured, those who aren't killed in the fight. Brown gets put on trial and he becomes a victim of the South's justice. But that makes him a hero in the North, where they're looking at Brown going, oh, he's a martyr for the cause. He's like Jesus Christ. He's giving his life for the freedom of others. Southerners see him as a villain, and they think that he's so dangerous because he inspires slaves to dare to get their freedom. And they don't even want news about him going around because they're afraid that slave folks will listen to it, enslaved people will hear it, and they will find weapons and kill their masters. So this raid is a failure in terms of actually doing what it plans, but it is, in the fight against slavery, actually a key point in pushing the North and the South even further apart. That's the end of this lecture of a lot of events in the 1850s that helped to drive the North and the South closer and closer to civil war.